diplomacy in action, not just at a distance.
Time for a beautiful quote, actually. I cannot lead you into battle. I do not give you laws or administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and to all the peoples of our brotherhood of nations. It's coming up to 10 o'clock now. You're listening to a BBC News special. I am stepping out. Jim Naughty will be taking over.
It's 10 o'clock. You're listening to a BBC News special with Michal Hussain and James Naughty to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We'll be continuing to remember the Queen's life, and we'll hear from those who have observed close up that long reign. First, Chris Aldridge with a summary of the news.
Buckingham Palace has announced that Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest-serving monarch, has died at the age of 96. In a statement, officials said she passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle, ending her reign of 70 years. Senior royals had travelled to be with her earlier after the palace announced that doctors had expressed concerns about her health. World leaders have been sending their condolences to the royal family. Our political correspondent Ione Wells reports.
Tributes have poured in from across the political divide. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has described Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as the rock on which modern Britain was built.
She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. She was the very spirit of Great Britain.
The leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, said the nation will always treasure her life of service and devotion, and said above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon.
The late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen. Above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest serving and greatest ever monarch.
The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, called the Queen an ever-fixed mark in our lives. And the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, said her life was one of extraordinary dedication and service.
Scotland loved, respected and admired her. And by all accounts, Her Majesty was really happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
Former Prime Ministers have all paid their tributes, with Boris Johnson calling today the country's saddest day, and Theresa May saying she was admired not just by her own people, but far beyond our family of nations.
Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world, and her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family.
That is reflected in the tributes that have also poured in from international politicians too, with President Macron of France calling her a friend of France, and President Zelensky of Ukraine extending his condolences to this irreparable loss.
The crown passes immediately to her son Charles, who will be officially known as King Charles III. He said his mother's death was a moment of great sadness for him and his family, and that her loss would be deeply felt around the world. This evening, 2 members of Buckingham Palace staff posted the formal notice of the Queen's death on an easel on the railings outside. Crowds continue to gather and lay flowers there as people mourn her death and reflect on her long life. These visitors gave their reaction.
She was a wonderful lady. She dedicated her whole life to the nation, and we could just thank her for it.
It's devastating. She's going to be missed by so many people. She affected so many lives, and she was an absolutely amazing monarch. She meant everything to me, my family, a sense of community, loyalty.
The news of the Queen's death has shocked people not just in the UK but around the world, where 14 other countries had her as head of state, including Australia, Canada and Jamaica. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the Queen one of his favourite people in the world. Pope Francis paid tribute to what he called her life of unstinting service. National flags are flying at half-mast, including at the White House, where President Biden described the Queen as a stateswoman of unmatched dignity. His spokeswoman, Karine Jean-Pierre, extended her condolences.
The United Kingdom is one of our closest allies, and again, our hearts go to the people of the United Kingdom, to the Queen, and to her family.
Planned strikes by rail and postal workers have been called off in response to the Queen's death. Stoppages were due to be held on the 15th and 17th of September. And Royal Mail workers, members of the Communication Workers Union, who walked out this morning, have cancelled the second day of their strike tomorrow.
Chris Aldridge, thank you. You're listening to a BBC News special following the death of the Queen. And our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond, is with me. Johnny, we've had a great deal of reflection on the Queen's life and what she brought to the country in the last few hours. Let's look ahead for a moment at what's likely to happen over the next few days. Clearly, there are detailed plans. They've not been officially announced yet. Can you give us a feeling for the shape of what lies ahead?
Well, James, there are two interlinked paths now. There is one which reflects the mourning for the life of the Queen. That will focus at first on Balmoral and Scotland, and then at some point I think the expectation is that the focus will change and move to the capital, here to London. And obviously there have been extensive preparations for a period of mourning and then eventually for a funeral, and that will take place over the next few days. The second part is about looking to the future, and it is about the new king. I think there is an expectation we will hear from the king. Obviously, he gave a statement pretty quickly after the death of the Queen was announced, but I would think we will hear from the king. And there will be a focus, I think, on continuity of the crown and a settling in of the head of state. The link between them is, of course, the mourning, which is both focused on the Queen, but also is felt by the King. And I think we will see that as a part of the continuity, but also a reflection of the personal loss that the King feels. So it will be a busy time, without any doubt, over the next few days. And it will be a time where we hear both about the life of the Queen, the mourning, the death of the Queen, but also get an understanding of the future that is to come.
It's interesting, you make the point about the link between, as it were, the statecraft of the transition to the King's realm from what went before, as distinct from, the sense of mourning and, the family grief for a mother, grandfather, grandmother and great-grandmother. Although, from the nation's point of view, the fact that the Queen was 96 lived a long and productive life to the end. Goodness me, she was giving a Prime Minister the seals of office 2 days before she died. So there is a sense in which it's not a tragic death. It's a death that will touch people very deeply. When they see a picture or hear her voice of some event that they've been at or they've seen, it will no doubt pierce them quite sharply. But there is a sense that it's a preparation for the next phase.
Yeah, it is very different from the death of her father, which very few of our listeners, of course, will remember. Yeah. But he was taken from her and taken from the nation really rather unexpected.
In his early 50s.
Indeed. The Queen, as we know, was 96. And as you say, had led a very, very full and productive life. And perhaps to the envy of some, had remained very active, really, to the end, as you say, really, until 2 days ago, 1 day ago. So yes, that I think means there will be perhaps more of a sense of appreciation of the decades that have come before, and less of the sense of shock and the stunned nation that there was in the death of her father, King George VI.
Johnny, for the moment, thanks again.
It's 9 minutes past 10. Let's look back at some of the tributes that have been paid today in these hours since we had news of the Queen's passing from our political leaders. The Prime Minister Liz Truss addressed the nation shortly after Buckingham Palace announced the news.
We are all devastated by the news that we have just heard from Balmoral. The death of Her Majesty the Queen is a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. Today the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
And the new King, Charles III, is expected to address the nation tomorrow. More tributes now. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon paid this tribute on behalf of the people of Scotland.
Like everyone across Scotland, the United Kingdom, indeed the world, I feel a deep sense of sadness on the death of Her Majesty the Queen. On behalf of the people of Scotland, I offer my sincere and heartfelt condolences to the King, the Queen Consort, and to the entire royal family. There will be many opportunities in the coming days to reflect fully on the Queen's extraordinary life and service. For more than 70 years, Queen Elizabeth has been the great constant in our national life. She has inspired us, on occasion comforted us, and always personified values we hold dear.
And the Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford said this.
It is with great sadness that we learn today of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She has been the only monarch that most of us will remember, and today the country feels an immense loss. Throughout her long and exceptional life, as our longest reigning monarch, Her Majesty firmly upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales. We're now joined by Sir Nicholas Soames, former Conservative MP, of course, and grandson of Sir Winston Churchill, the Queen's first Prime Minister. And Sir Nicholas, you will have memories as a young boy of the relationship that your grandfather had with the young Queen.
Well, good evening, Jim, on a very black day indeed. Yes, I do. I mean, I can't pretend that I ever saw them together, because I didn't. But my grandfather, as you know, absolutely revered the Queen. He saw in her the sort of birth of a new Britain after the Second World War, the new Elizabethan age, as he christened it. And all his hopes and all his most cherished hopes actually were vested in her, I think. And they have been triumphantly vindicated by a lifetime of impeccable service.
It was an extraordinary coming together of a man whose life stretched back into the Victorian age, who'd, served in government during the First World War, who had then seen the country through the Second World War, of course. And here was this apparently fragile young woman put on the throne by two accidents, really. One, the abdication, and secondly, the early death of her father, probably hastened by the war, who suddenly found herself in a position where she was trying to find a voice to help to pull the country together after all those traumas, with a man who, was from a different generation, a different age. It was a remarkable coming together, wasn't it?
It was indeed, Jim. And of course, it's such an extraordinary thing, the telescope of history, when you think that the Queen's first Prime Minister had charged on a horse with a sword at the Battle of Omdurman, while her present Prime Minister wasn't even born when she ascended the throne. And Churchill himself served 6 of the kings and queens of Britain. And I'm older than you are, Jim, I think.
Just.
We've only ever known one queen.
Yes.
And we've only ever known one monarch, and I've grown up in the shadow of that monarch.
Well, of course, this is the point that people have been making, for the last several hours, that for most people in the country, save those who are a good deal older than you or I, Sir Nicholas, have only known this glue that has helped to hold the country together without making a single political misstep in all those years. Now, you were a practicing politician to some extent, still are, and so you know how easy it is in the rocks and shoals of politics just to slip and make a fool of yourself and fall over and have to pick yourself up and so on. Here she was, treading some of the most treacherous waters between nations, between fractious political leaders in the Commonwealth, in Europe, with Ireland, everywhere else, and hardly a foot out of place.
No, never a foot wrong, and navigating, as you say, the most extraordinary difficulties and complexities, particularly in the Commonwealth and of course domestically. And I think it's one of the greatest things about the Queen's reign that she managed, in an era of brute celebrity, to retain a sort of familiarity with her people at the same time as being the mystique of the monarchy.
Well, that is quite an extraordinary achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, exceptional achievement. And really, over 70 years, I think it is remarkable. And she did it by just being very, very, very good at what she did.
And that, of course, is the example and the challenge for King Charles III, a close friend of your own, whom you've known for many, many years, and whom you admire, for what he will take from his mother's example.
Well, he will take from his mother's example. He's been very well prepared indeed for this sad and black day. He will observe, of course, all the conventions of monarchy, and I expect him to do a really brilliant job. I think he will do it very well, but he undoubtedly will need the support of the whole country. And I thought what the Prime Minister said herself was very, very good. I thought that she struck exactly the right note, and we need to support King Charles III as he ascends to the throne.
To what extent do you think that he has absorbed the most important lessons of statesmanship, which he's now going to have to exercise, that ability to be at once familiar to the nation, someone to whom the nation can look to for guidance and for support in times of trouble, and yet retain a kind of distance, which was, as you pointed out, one of the great achievements of the Queen, to be a friend and yet to be someone who was just a slight step away.
Yes, I think that's a very good description of it, Jim, and the answer is that he will, because he knows very, very well what are the conventions of the monarchy, and he's seen how brilliant his mother was at it, and I'm quite sure that he will be exactly the same. And it's well known that the Prince of Wales holds strong opinions on many of them. Indeed, he's been years ahead of lots of people on endless issues. But when he becomes, and now he is the king, clearly he's in a different space altogether, and there can be no question of the expression of those views in the same way. It just won't happen.
It changes, and I don't know, it must be daunting. You made the point, Sir Nicholas, that the Prince of Wales as we knew him, King Charles III as we now know him, has obviously known this day would come. He's prepared for it intellectually, in all kinds of practical ways, thinking about how you run the show, whether it should be slimmed down or all these things. Of course he's thought about it, and yet today we shouldn't forget that this is a moment of personal transition which has a great deal of sadness in it.
I think that's completely true, Jim, and, I think it's worth reflecting that the Prince of Wales is a dutiful son to a much-loved mother. He lost his father last year. It's not been a great time, and I think he inherits and ascends to the throne at a very, very difficult time for this country. And I am confident that everything that he has learnt from his mother's reign, he will apply diligently and astutely. I mean, there's no one I know who works as hard as the Prince of Wales does. I mean, he's so committed to so many excellent causes to which he devotes an enormous amount of time. And I think he will be a very, very wise, sage, sensible king. And just the right person, I think, to ascend to the throne at this time. But I don't think one wants to in any way forget that this is a very difficult time indeed.
Sir Nicholas Soames, thank you very much for joining us.
You're listening to our special programme across BBC radio stations with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein. Let's turn to the Queen and her religious faith. She was a person of great faith. She was a committed Christian. We've heard about that already this afternoon, and she was also interested in the UK's other faith communities as well. Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, joins us now. Good evening, Archbishop.
Good evening.
I remember speaking to you really not so very long ago on the day of the St Paul's service to commemorate the Platinum Jubilee. What are your thoughts on the passing of Her Majesty?
Well, yes, I do remember that very happy day, but also I suppose that was the day, wasn't it, when we first realised that, something was up and the Queen's health was deteriorating. And I've just come back from York Minster, where we cobbled together. We didn't even start planning the service till just after 7. The service took place at 8:30, and it was amazing how many people, kind of in a very short space of time, gathered together for a simple service of prayer and thanksgiving for the Queen's life. And I suppose we're all feeling a bit of shock, really, at the moment, first of all, as we know in our own families, and now we're experiencing it as the family of our nation. When someone dies, even if you know that death is approaching, it's still a terrible shock. So yes, we're shocked, but at the same time, we're very thankful. Her reign has been happy and glorious. And she represents a continuity and a stability, the likes of which I don't suppose any of us will ever see again. So, yes, shock, obviously sorrow, but also profound thanksgiving. And probably most of all, as we gathered in York Minster this evening and offered prayer for the repose of her soul, for King Charles, for our nation, I think I was reminded of her great Christian faith. So as well as shock, as well as sorrow, as well as thanksgiving, also hope, that she lived and died in the hope of the Christian faith. And our world needs that hope, and we have much to learn from the example of her life and service.
Yes, I mean, certainly her religious faith was very important to her, and she'd spoken publicly about how it had sustained her at difficult points in her life, bereavement, for example. Remind me, did you get... I was going to say get to know her personally. I mean, she's the Queen, so there's, as someone described earlier, there's like an invisible moat around her. But through the course of your work, did you get to spend time?
I did. Yes, I mean, I did a bit. I can't pretend that I knew her well. Of course, I didn't. But I think what I did discover was there's been a long tradition which she inherited from her father, which carried on until only a year or so ago, that in January, when she was always in Sandringham, she would have a house parties at the weekends, and always a bishop was invited. And you knew when you became a bishop that you would get an invite, and sure enough, I did. And it was I was very nervous going to stay that weekend. But what impressed me over the course of the weekend, when I have to say, great fun, it was a time of great joy, was her Christian faith. And the reason I was there was, yes, as a guest, alongside other guests, but also there to be the person who led the prayers, to preach in Sandringham Parish Church on Sunday morning. And so what I saw in her that weekend was, oh goodness, this is a person whose faith really matters to them. In fact, I've since then said on many occasions, you can't really understand the Queen and her great sense of duty and service to the nation, her understanding of her place as Queen as a vocation. You can't understand that without understanding her Christian faith, which is why, as I say, although we're shocked, although we're sorrowful, I am also praying tonight in thanksgiving and hopefulness for the repose of her soul. You know, the Christian prayer when someone dies is always, may they rest in peace and rise in glory. She believed that. And, you know, I suppose I want to say, again to myself, to the people I'll be serving in our nation in the coming days, that this life is not all that there is. This life, however glorious it is, or indeed however hard it is not all that there is. There is more. And she knew that, and she lived by that, and in that hope, she died today in that hope. And of course, you won't be surprised to hear me say, at a time of challenge for our nation, of transition in all kinds of ways, I think we need that hope. And I hope, therefore, that as people remember and honour her life and her service to our nation, and I know people will want to do something with their shock and sorrow and their thanksgivings, the doors of our churches will be open. I don't just mean the Church of England, every denomination. And as I say, people were gathering in York Minster this evening. I know that thousands and thousands of people will come to our churches in the coming days. And I would say, come. Whatever your faith, whether you don't even think you have any faith, if you just need to come to a place where sorrows and joys can be taken seriously, come.
There's a line that stood out to me in the prayer that the Church of England has issued this evening. May her example continue to inspire us.
Yes, and that's precisely what my prayer has been, because, as I say, her life, it's a strange thing to say, really, someone whose life was unimaginably different to all of our lives. Yet it actually was a life of simplicity, of dedicated service. I mean, only 2 days ago, she was, receiving the new Prime Minister in Balmoral, and there's wonderful photos which I think we're all going to treasure as the last images most of us will have seen of her, with a twinkle in her eye and a smile, doing her duty. I'm sure it'll be quoted many times in the coming days. The pledge she made in 1947, aged just 21, that whether her life would be long or short, it would be a life of service, pledging herself to the life of our nation. Now those are sometimes called old-fashioned values, these values of service and dedication and duty. I think of them as Christian values. I think they're what our world and our culture really, really needs. And so, yes, her example is something that we can all learn from, whether we think of ourselves as a Christian or not. Though, as I say, I would say, I don't think the Queen's service, example, faithfulness, makes sense without her knowing that even she, the Queen, bent the knee somewhere else to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Archbishop, thank you very much. Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York.
10:30 now. We can go to North East Scotland. We were hearing about Balmoral from the Archbishop a moment ago, and our correspondent James Shaw is up in the northeast, where, of course, the family has gathered at Balmoral. That place, James, you and I were there together on Tuesday for that moment at which one Prime Minister gave way to another, with the Queen taking the hand of each of them. That place where the family have gathered it's not just a place that she goes in the summer, some sort of cottage to get away from it all. I don't mean the fact that it's a castle rather than a cottage, but as a place, she was embedded in it, wasn't she? The surroundings, the countryside, the tranquility, and the privacy and community.
Yeah, all aspects, Jim, I think, of that place were significant for her, and many aspects of it she enjoyed. Walking in the countryside, having family barbecues in the grounds of the castle. It was a place, you're right, that she treasured, and of course there is this long royal tradition started by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the 19th century of it being a holiday home for the royal family, and she honoured that tradition and she enjoyed it, and it seems that she preferred to be in this corner of northeast Scotland in preference to perhaps almost anywhere else in the world. And one thing I thought, you said there, of course, Jim, that we were both outside Balmoral on Tuesday, and that was one of the really striking things I thought about this week, the fact that we saw those still photos of the Queen with the new Prime Minister Liz Truss, and in those photos she looks alert, she looks as if she is focused on what is happening, perhaps even enjoying the significance of that event, still doing her duty, almost up to the last hour of her life. I mean, I think that is really extraordinary. I don't know if there is any parallel for that in the history of the royal family, but I think that's one of the things that will really stay with me from this week, is the fact that she was still doing her job, doing her duty, right up until the last week of her life.
And Balmoral, of course, is a place of mourning tonight. The family has gathered. Her children, her grandchildren are there. And we think that the King Charles III, and the Queen Consort will make their way to London tomorrow morning. Is that your understanding?
That's what we've been told. I think there was indeed an official announcement earlier on today, Jim, just, saying that the family, the senior members of it, many members, the closest members of the Queen's family are at the castle tonight, and that King Charles and the Queen Consort Camilla will travel to London tomorrow. We don't know the exact timing of that, when they will leave, and when other members of the family will leave Balmoral. Perhaps they will want to stay there for a while because of that tranquility, the peace that you talked about, which is going to be in contrast to the momentous, the huge ceremonial, sombre events that are going to be happening over the next 10 days in London, in other parts of the United Kingdom. So maybe they will treasure the moments of tranquility which they are experiencing, of course, alongside the deep mourning that family is in this evening and tonight.
James Shaw in the northeast, thank you very much. And of course the details of those events to which James referred have not been issued formally yet by Buckingham Palace, and it's expected in the next few hours, perhaps by tomorrow morning, we will know the shape of the national mourning which is to take place. We know it will obviously culminate.
Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
She wasn't born to be queen, yet she became Britain's longest-lived and longest-reigning monarch. Across the decades, as society changed fundamentally, Elizabeth II was a constant and, for many, a reassuring symbol of national unity. It was a life, above all, which was guided by her sense of duty, something she'd first referred to in a broadcast at the age of 21.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on the 21st of April 1926. She was the first child of the then King's second son, the Duke of York. 10 years later, Princess Elizabeth's life was transformed when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abandoned the throne to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. The throne passed to her father, who became George VI. The early years of George's reign were dominated by the Second World War. Elizabeth was expected to play her part. With her younger sister Margaret, Elizabeth broadcast a message to children evacuated overseas.
When peace comes, remember, it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
When she was 18, Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. As the war drew to a close, she joined other recruits learning how to drive and service military vehicles.
This is the BBC Home Service. The end of the war in Europe was officially announced by Mr. Churchill at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Hundreds of thousands of people packed in the space in front of Buckingham Palace. The dense sea of faces, they stretch away down the mall as far as you can see.
In May 1945, when crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, Elizabeth slipped out to witness the scenes on London's streets.
I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall. All of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief. I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life.
By then, Princess Elizabeth had fallen in love with Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. He was nominally a Prince of Greece, though of largely Danish extraction, who was serving in the Royal Navy. The relationship had developed over several years. Their wedding in November 1947 was described by Winston Churchill as a flash of colour in grey post-war Britain.
The wedding march peals out gaily through the Abbey. The procession of the bride and bridegrooms moves now down through the 2,000 guests who are standing here, bowing as the procession passes towards the Great West Door.
The early years of their married life were relaxed, but that ended unexpectedly in 1952. Her father, George VI, died while Elizabeth was in East Africa.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy.
Elizabeth's coronation the following year was televised. It was watched by millions.
O God, the crown of the faithful, bless, we beseech thee, this crown, and so sanctify thy servant Elizabeth, upon whose head this day thou dost place it for a sign of royal majesty.
The moment of the Queen's crowning is come.
She became queen at a moment of immense change. Britain was recovering from the Second World War. The empire her ancestors had once ruled over was disappearing, to be replaced by the Commonwealth. In Britain in the 1960s, as society evolved, public attitudes to the monarchy changed. To combat the impression of a distant institution, the Queen was persuaded, not least by her husband, to allow television cameras to show her and her family, by now she had 4 children, at work and at play. The film Royal Family was groundbreaking.
Yes, ma'am.
So, do you think we could bring up those papers that I was looking at yesterday?
It gave a glimpse behind the scenes.
Well, it seemed to me there was much too much about history in it, which obviously they know.
Yes.
Their own history. Perhaps there wasn't enough about trying to say thank you for, what they'd done.
A decade later, in 1977, the Silver Jubilee was celebrated with street parties, pageants and fireworks. Britain's respect for the monarchy was affirmed. In 1981, a disturbed youth fired 6 blank shots as she rode to the Trooping the Colour ceremony on Horse Guards Parade. A year later, a man was imprisoned for breaking into her palace bedroom. Away from such dramas, the Queen enjoyed being a constitutional monarch. She had the right to be consulted by her ministers, to advise and to warn. She took it seriously, adroitly handling the political side of her reign and her weekly meetings with her prime ministers. In the 1990s, the Queen allowed the cameras back in. This time, the focus was much more on her work. She spoke about her duties and the nature of her life.
If you live in this sort of life, you live very much by tradition and by continuity. You know exactly what you're going to be doing 2 months hence. Or this is what the younger members find difficult, is the regimented side of it.
By 1992, there'd been fairy tale royal weddings and painful separations. To cap it all, there was a fire at Windsor Castle, a grimly appropriate symbol of a family and an institution facing difficulties. Suffering from a sore throat, the Queen admitted in a speech that it had been a difficult 12 months.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
This is BBC Radio in London. According to the French news agency, a French government minister has said within the past few minutes that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died.
The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in a car crash in Paris in 1997 shook the country and the monarchy. It was the Queen's most difficult week. She was accused of being out of touch when she stayed at her Balmoral estate in Scotland, caring for the young princes, William and Harry. When the Queen did return to London, she delivered an unprecedented live broadcast on the eve of Diana's funeral.
I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
Her 50 years on the throne were marked in 2002. The year began with sadness, with the death of her mother and her younger sister, Margaret. The Queen had little time to mourn, though, as a major programme for her Golden Jubilee took her around the country. People turned out in their thousands. Once again, the cynics were proved wrong. One of the highlights of the Jubilee was a pop concert inside the grounds of Buckingham Palace. 3 years later, the once unthinkable became a reality. Prince Charles married his long-term companion, Camilla Parker Bowles. The Queen didn't attend the civil wedding ceremony, but she was present for the blessing at Windsor Castle. A year later, the Queen celebrated her 80th birthday. It was an opportunity to reflect on life as an octogenarian.
As one gets older, birthdays seem to come round quicker. They are therefore less obviously excuses for wider celebration than personal moments to count one's blessings. As Groucho Marx once said, anyone can get old. All you have to do is to live long enough.
She'd become the most travelled monarch in British history, making official or state visits to more than 100 different countries. Many were memorable. This was Australia a few months after her coronation.
She'd come a long way, that little lady. And all Sydney could think of was making that long journey worthwhile.
Others were groundbreaking. To West Germany in 1965, helping to heal relations after the Second World War. She also went on to visit China and Russia. Much of her foreign travel was to the countries of the Commonwealth, the association of nations which she championed throughout her reign. Her role as head of the Commonwealth was of great importance to her, and her fellow feeling with African leaders opposed to the apartheid regime in South Africa helped to overcome tensions within the Commonwealth in the 1980s. In May 2011, the Queen made one of the most significant state visits of her long reign when she became the first British monarch to travel to the Irish Republic since the country gained independence from the United Kingdom. In Dublin, she spoke of the painful legacy the two countries shared.
We can never forget those who have died or been injured and their families. To all those who have suffered as a consequence of our troubled past, I extend my sincere thoughts and deep sympathy. With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would wish had been done differently.
or not at all.
A year later, she shook hands for the first time with Martin McGuinness, then Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister, who'd once been a senior member of the IRA. In June 2012, a national service of thanksgiving was held at St Paul's Cathedral to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. A month later, at the opening of the London Olympics, she played herself in a spoof James Bond film.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
By now she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and in September 2015 she became Britain's longest-serving monarch when she surpassed the length of Queen Victoria's reign. It wasn't something, the Queen said, that she'd ever aspired to.
Inevitably, a long life can pass by many milestones. My own is no exception. But I thank you all, and the many others at home and overseas, for your touching messages of great kindness.
She continued with her public duties well into her 90s. There was further family turmoil. Prince Andrew was forced to withdraw from public life over his ill-judged friendship with a convicted American sex offender, and allegations, strongly denied, that he'd assaulted a 17-year-old girl. And the Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, decided that they wanted to step back from royal life. They were unsettling moments, presided over by a monarch who showed that her sense of commitment was undiminished. It was evident again during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. The Queen, in isolation at Windsor for her own protection from the virus, broadcast a reassuring message to the nation.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Her personal resilience was tested in the spring of 2021 when her beloved husband Philip died 2 months short of his 100th birthday. At his funeral within Windsor Castle, curtailed by the social distancing requirements of the pandemic, the Queen seemed a solitary figure. But despite the great sadness of the loss of her husband of 73 years, there was never any question of her withdrawing from the path of duty. She marked the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, a record no other British monarch had achieved, in February 2022. By then it was apparent that she was rather more frail physically than before. Her doctors had advised her to take things a little easier. Light duties was the expression used by the palace. In a message to mark her 70 years on the throne, she said she was grateful for and humbled by the loyalty and affection she'd received throughout her reign. And she signed the statement, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." By June 2022, and the public celebration of her Platinum Jubilee, her declining health limited the events she could attend. There was, however, a delightful surprise, a pre-recorded appearance, a somewhat chaotic tea party with Paddington Bear.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here. For later.
This was a monarch at peace and enjoying herself. On the final day of the Jubilee celebrations, there was a final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The national anthem was sung. A much-loved monarch acknowledged the many thousands who'd waited to greet her. The crowds cheered, but finally it was time to go. The Queen turned to depart from the balcony on which she'd first been seen as a baby in June 1927. There was an unspoken feeling that an era was drawing to a close. For decade after decade, Elizabeth II embodied the strengths of a constitutional monarch, a steadfast and reassuring presence in a constantly shifting world, representing a changing kingdom to itself and to the wider world. Hers was a life guided by Christian faith and by the unfaltering sense of duty to which she'd pledged herself on her 21st birthday. It was something she'd reflected on during her Silver Jubilee in 1977.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Voice of the Queen at her Silver Jubilee in 1977. That was Nicholas Witchell, a royal correspondent, and some of the highlights of her royal life. You will realise that all national BBC radio stations have been brought together for this special programme reflecting the life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, whose death was announced a few hours ago by Buckingham Palace.
And with us in the studio is Giles Brandreth, former MP, writer, broadcaster and friend of the late Prince Philip. Initially, Giles, you knew him through a charity, and then you got to know him and the Queen. It's fascinating to hear her talk about, her salad days when she was green in judgment. Really, it feels like, was she ever like that? It seems like her judgment was so finely tuned throughout her life.
She was a remarkable person, wasn't she? And a remarkable person for so long. I mean, she was very much, in my view, the best of people, and she always saw the best in people. She had a very happy childhood and was always grateful to that. Her mother, everyone was charmed by her mother. She loved her mother. The Queen adored her father, but she felt, I think, that she learnt kingship from her grandfather, George V, who was the king during the First World War, and whose death back in 1935 was the first sort of serious death that she as a little girl confronted. And she was interested in history. She learnt British history. She was conscious her favourite home, along with Balmoral, was undoubtedly Windsor Castle. And she loved being there, and she was aware that that was the history of the British monarchy, built after the Norman conquest by William the Conqueror. Every sovereign from that time onwards had spent time at Windsor Castle, and so she knew that she was part of this heritage. She seemed to take it with such an even keel. She was always very even, very calm, very good humour. There was a lightness of touch about the Queen, but to see her and Prince Philip together, they were an extraordinary double act, because he was dynamic, thrusting, forward-looking, whereas she was naturally quite conservative. I asked her private secretary about that once. I said, is she quite conservative? He said, no, not conservative with anything small c. She does follow precedent. She likes things to be done the way they were, as a rule. But the reason she goes quite slowly, it's deliberate. She believes she should walk at the pace of the slowest person in the kingdom, so that no one in this country should ever feel left behind.
It's very interesting to hear you say that she learnt kingship from her grandfather, because this would have been the period between the age of about 10, when when it was obvious that the line of succession was changing, till the time that she became queen. But the model that she had then as a monarch was a monarch of a different age compared to hers.
Totally different age. And she was quite serious, I think, as a young person. I mean, her sister was allowed to be the playful one, whereas the Queen was serious. Right from an early age, she adored horses. She had little model horses, as well as her own ponies, given to her by her grandfather. But she, famously, she wrote an account when the old king died, and then there was the abdication, which caused trauma in the family. She wrote an account for her parents, at her father's suggestion, of their coronation for her parents, in her own beautiful handwriting. And she recorded how, going to the Abbey, the carriage had been quite jolty at first, but we got used to it. And I think getting used to it was what it was all about. She used to say, well, the crown is very heavy, If you leant forward, you topple over. So she wore it, the state crown, when doing her work, sitting in her drawing room, literally slippers and dressing gown on, and the crown on top, in order to get used to it. She took her duty very seriously. That was her life, driven by duty, sustained by faith, and kept happy by those passions, her dogs and her horses.
And a very solid marriage. Charles, thank you very much, Giles Brandreth.
What a lovely anecdote. We're going to go to Balmoral now. Giles was mentioning Windsor and Balmoral. So tied up in the Queen's life. James Cook, our correspondent, is at the gates of the castle now. It will be dark and I dare say wet, James. What developments do you expect in the morning when this first night has passed?
Well, the first thing to say is that the King himself is spending the night here at the Balmoral estate, this place that was so special to the Queen, the place that she is said to have perhaps loved more than any other place. And as you rightly suggest, Jim, life here does continue, and the constancy is represented in the fact that the power has been transferred. It's been handed from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles, and indeed life continues on the estate as well. The River Dee continues to rush under Isambard Kingdom Brunel's bridge just a short distance from me here. The rain, as you suggested, continues to teem down, and tomorrow the wheels begin to turn, and we presume that at some point the King himself will travel to London, and arrangements will be made for the funeral, although that is some time away now, isn't it?
Indeed. One of the things that was striking, James, at Balmoral on Tuesday, when the handover of power, not in a royal sense but in a prime ministerial sense, took place, the last engagement that the Queen fulfilled as an official function, was that you had on the one hand the statecraft that was being displayed, transfer of power, and yet there was a kind of intimacy. This is something that was happening in a home, in a place that she loved, where she was completely embedded, not just in the castle and in the way of life there, but almost in the landscape. You know, it's a place that is utterly synonymous with the life she wanted to lead in the summer and the autumn of each year since she was a child.
That's right. She has, as you say, been coming here for many, many years, and I think one point to note in that regard was the photograph that the royal family chose to release on the death of her beloved husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. It was a photograph taken just a short distance from here in the hills of this landscape on Royal Deeside, and to that point the castle here was built for Queen Victoria in the 1850s, and on seeing Balmoral for the first time, she said all seemed to breathe freedom and peace and to make one forget the world and its sad travails.
Indeed, under what Byron called the steep frowning glories of dark Loch Nagar, that mountain which, well, you won't be able to see it, James, because it's dark, but you know where it is as well as I do. It's gorgeous country. James Cook, outside Balmoral Castle. Thank you very much.
You're listening to BBC News with our special coverage in the aftermath of the announcement that Queen Elizabeth II, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 96. This is BBC News with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein, broadcasting on all the BBC's UK radio networks to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We will continue to remember her life and to hear from those who have observed her long reign and seen her and have their own memories of her. First, though, to Chris Aldridge with a summary.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at her Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire. She was 96 and had served as head of state for 70 years. In a statement, Clarence House confirmed that the new king, the Queen's eldest son, would be known as King Charles III. He said the death of his much-loved mother was a moment of great sadness for him and his family. The Queen had 15 prime ministers during her reign, and every living one has paid tribute. Sir Tony Blair said her reign had been glorious and the country had lost its matriarch. David Cameron said no words could adequately express the sense of loss the nation would feel. Boris Johnson said it was the country's saddest day. Liz Truss, Theresa May, Gordon Brown and Sir John Major have also been remembering Britain's longest-serving monarch.
She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. She was the very spirit of Great Britain.
Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world, and her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers with the royal family.
It's the whole world that is in mourning tonight because she was a compassionate, dedicated, wonderful public servant, and as we saw this week when she introduced and met a new Prime Minister, she served the people of this country right until the last.
There was a great deal of amusement in them, there was a great deal of humour in them, there was a bit of gossip in them. And apart from that, the serious matters that were discussed, I think people would have been extraordinarily surprised if they realised the depth of information the Queen had. She was always extraordinarily well briefed, and those meetings with the Queen were one of the better parts of a Prime Minister's week.
The leader of the largest party in Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, said she was grateful for the Queen's significant contribution and determined efforts in advancing the peace and reconciliation process. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, have also paid their respects.
On behalf of the Welsh Government and people in all parts of Wales, I offer our deepest condolences to all Her Majesty's children and their families on this sad occasion.
Scotland loved, respected and admired her, and by all accounts Her Majesty was really happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
Commonwealth leaders have been expressing their sadness. India's Narendra Modi said she was a stalwart of our times. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa said the pair had looked at letters she'd been sent by Nelson Mandela, who he said she had respected enormously. New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Canada's Justin Trudeau said it was a sad day for their country.
I know I speak for all New Zealanders in conveying our deepest sympathy to members of the royal family and condolences to King Charles III on behalf of the government and New Zealanders at this time of enormous loss.
As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more.
Other world leaders have reflected on her 70-year reign. Micheál Martin said she had been a wonderful friend of Ireland. Russia's Vladimir Putin said she had authority on the world stage. And Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky said it was a heavy loss for Europe and the world.
From all the Ukrainians, I express sincere condolences to the royal family, the whole of the UK and the Commonwealth countries. Our thoughts and prayers are with you.
The world's other royal families have been making statements too. Sweden's King Carl Gustaf said she had always been dear to his family. King Philippe and Queen Mathilde of Belgium said she was an amazing personality. And Spain's King Felipe said she would be remembered as one of the greatest queens of all time.
Chris, thank you. Chris Aldridge there. Good evening. It is 11:05 and you're listening to a BBC News special with James Naughtie and Michelle Hussein. Before I turn to Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, I'm just going to read a little bit of President Macron's statement earlier because it has some really lovely lines in it. He writes of the Queen, the Queen of 16 Kingdoms loved France, which loved her back. This evening, the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth are mourning their Queen. The people of France join them in their grief. She who stood with the giants of the 20th century on the path of history has now left to join them. So many beautiful words, Johnny, have been written today. So many really beautiful tributes have been paid to the Queen. It's very striking, one after the other. People are really striving to find the words that sum up her life.
It is striking. I have to say, President Macron came up with some stunning lines just there, as he did on the occasion of the Queen's Jubilee, when he spoke of her being the golden thread that bound our two nations together. But wherever you look in the tributes that have come, to be honest, whether they've come from monarchs and presidents, or whether they've come from those gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Balmoral, has come an eloquence that is breathtaking. And it is it is a sign, again, a reminder of the affection in which the Queen was held, but also that something about her office brings out the best in those who are speaking of her as well. I mean, she who wrote so beautifully herself is now being spoken of with such grace and such measured respect. It is a tribute to her, that the tributes to her are so beautiful.
Let's go back a few hours, if we may, to Balmoral, to the place where she died, and also to the gathering this evening and into tonight of her children and some of her grandchildren.
Yeah, I mean, and we should ponder the fact that Balmoral, which she loved so much, her summer retreat for so many decades, was the place where she would end her life. It's not for us to speculate on whether that would have brought her pleasure, but it is worth noting that it was a place that she found tremendous peace. It was the sign, of course, that this was a much more serious condition than simply exhaustion, when we heard that the members of her close family had changed their plans and were making their way with some haste towards Balmoral, a very serious sign. They are all still gathered there now, although Buckingham Palace, in its statement of the Queen's death, said that the new King and the Queen Consort would make their way to London tomorrow. And that is a sign and a reminder that this is more, obviously, than the death of a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. This is the death of the head of state, and that position has now passed to the man we will now know as King Charles III. And so when he comes to London, yes, he will still be in mourning, and there will be reminders of that throughout the days to come, but he will also be a new head of state and a sign of the continuity both of the crown and of the nation it sits atop.
Johnny, for now, thank you.
Continuity. Let's talk about that and history with historian Sir Simon Sharma, who, of course, has written a history of Britain and put the Queen's reign in that context. Simon, as you look at it, there are obviously chance elements to this, longevity, the moment at which she came to the throne by a series of chance events, really, the abdication in 36, the early death of her father in 1952, and yet what that 70 years did in the sweep of 20th century and indeed 21st century British history is quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, James. I think, if you think of actually all the other very long-lived monarchs, not as long-lived or long-reigned as her, but Elizabeth I and George III, indeed, and, of course, Queen Victoria, they all sort of had the wind at their backs in terms of the fact that Britain was more powerful, more prosperous, more dynamic when they died than at the beginning. But the Queen had to cope with all sorts of national traumas. The war, the first trauma really was that both her uncle did not want to be king and gave it up. Her father only, in a torturous way, had to become king, was agonized about it. He was, of course, famously shy, the brutal stammer, took the country through the war, came out of it. So the Queen, at 26, really, had to have some sense, even amidst all the kind of imperial stroke, Commonwealth grandeur of the coronation, that there were going to be rocky times ahead. And her whole reign is a history somehow of the difficulty of anchoring Britain again. But she turned out to be the anchor. You go back to, you remember well, miners' strike, Suez, Aberfan, the terrible days of the bombing of the IRA, one atrocity which took the life of Mountbatten. And the Queen somehow was a symbol of the fact that none of that would shake a sense of national community. She was the embodiment, the personification of how you can be a nation without hating, without egomania, without the kind of indecency of making enemies.
It's interesting that if you look at it in the context in which you're putting it, Simon, if you take the period of the abdication when the monarchy was rocked, certainly from the family's point of view, to a point where it was in genuine danger. But then look at a period like the 60s, where the old conventions were falling away, the age of deference was behind us, and so on. If you'd said to people that the Queen would be as popular as she continued to be to the end of her life, and had these extraordinary moments, the Diamond Jubilee, the Platinum Jubilee, and when you hear these tributes today, I guess if we'd been talking in, let's say, 1966, we would have said it was unlikely that someone could stabilise an institution like that over the period that lay ahead.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a very interesting, of all the Christmas messages, the most extraordinary was the famous one in 1983. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister, where the Queen said two extraordinary things. She said the problem of the world is and indeed within the Commonwealth, is the inequality of fortune between rich and poor nations. That, for a start, got the dander up, not just of Margaret Thatcher, but others, particularly Powell. But she said something a little later in the Christmas broadcast, even more insightful. She said technology, because it was all about communication, James. She said technology is a wonderful thing, but technology doesn't make for comradeship, tolerance, and I don't think she used the words affinity. So she had, I think, from her daily experience, the sense in which all the kind of bright sharpness of the new world of technology, the internet just starting, fell short when it came to what a national community, particularly one that was constantly searching of where it wanted to be in the world, actually craved. She saw that every year, the garden parties, just going to visit, town halls and villages and hospitals and all the rest of it. She lived it. So she lived a belief that actually that something was missing from modernity, and she was there to supply it.
And it was a kind of glue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In social terms.
Well, I think also in national terms. I mean, I think the great moment of the whole reign was in my view, was the Irish visit. First of all, the visit
was extraordinary.
The Dublin Castle speech, the visit, bowing her head at the Garden of Remembrance. Lord Mountbatten had been killed by an IRA bomb, then shaking the hand of Martin McGuinness a year later, I think it was, when she went to Belfast. And she said in her speech at Dublin Castle, we are all the product of history, which goodness knows she was. But there were times when you have to forget a little. I understand the pain of family sacrifice. There again, she had this fantastic instinct of saying even my family understands what other families go through. And sometimes we have to move beyond history. That's an extraordinary thing to do.
Simon Sharma, thanks very much.
Charles Brandreth is still with us in the studio. And of course, Charles, you knew her personally as well. You were behind the scenes. Where did all of this come from? The attitude, the example that Simon's describing?
Part of it, of course, was her faith. Absolutely fundamental to her life was being sustained by faith, saying her prayers on her knees. She believed worship to her was central to her life. She would go on a Sunday morning to church privately and then be seen later going again to church for the public appearance. Faith was everything to her. So things like reconciliation and forgiveness, the things we were talking about in relation to Ireland, they were part and parcel of what she fundamentally believed. She was, I think, born quite a serious-minded girl. Winston Churchill first came across her in the 1920s when she was only 2 or 3 years of age, and he wrote to his wife that he'd met Princess Elizabeth, and what a serious-minded, determined little person she seemed to be. So she had this sort of resolute quality, and she also was extremely steady. She claimed that she learned this from her mother, because during the war, when there were air raids, the Queen Mother resolutely refused to be seen running to the air raid shelter. She walked at a good pace. So the Queen learned to keep an even pace. You never saw the Queen rushing anywhere. And people who followed her around the world on her many tours, there was no sovereign had ever travelled so far around the world as the Queen did. But they marvelled at the fact that the Queen never seemed to perspire. She never seemed to get hot and bothered. She always was cool. And a global figure, mentioning going around the world. In the news bulletin we talked about her 15 prime ministers. She never talked about her 15 prime ministers. She knew she'd had dozens. And she could literally, almost as a part of peace, you could say, who's the Prime Minister of Zambia now? And she'd enjoy telling you. She was extraordinary. And of course, Monsieur Macron liked her. She spoke to him in French.
In perfect French. I remember being in Paris at the time of the Platinum Jubilee, and Macron's, the president's speech and his references to the Queen were extraordinary, really. I mean, they were very eloquent. He has that gift. But they were genuine. And there was a ceremony of relighting the eternal flame under the Arc de Triomphe, which is extraordinarily touching, given all the comings and goings between Paris and London in the last few years, for reasons which we know.
She was the embodiment of world history. For somebody like Macron, she had known General Charles de Gaulle.
Well, quite.
When she was a teenage girl.
Yes.
Because he was the leader of the Free French, based in London during the Second World War. She had met everybody and treated everybody as an equal. And she was a positive person. She took the role of being Queen seriously. She took, for example, the Order of the Garter seriously. This goes back hundreds of years. Honi soit mal y pense. Shame to him who evil thinks. She looked positively at everybody, wanted to see the best of everybody, and indeed she was the best of people, and I think as a consequence brought out the best in people.
I know someone who was once in a position where he was able to ask her, of all the public figures that she'd known and talked to over the years, who had impressed her fundamentally the most. And without a flicker of hesitation, she replied Nelson Mandela. And when asked why, she said she had never met anyone with less rancour, who had more reason to be rancorous. A very interesting answer.
It's fascinating. I mean, that kind of consideration, that compassion, courtesy, kindness, generosity, but also such great good humour. That's the only regret I have about the Queen, is that we didn't see more until the end of her life of what a playful person she was. I once had a conversation with her about pantomime at Windsor Castle, asking her what her happiest times were at Windsor Castle. She said, being the principal boy in the pantomime. Really? And she said she wouldn't mind having been an actress, but she became a queen. And towards the end of her life, we realised what a brilliant actress she would have been. I mean, my goodness. There she was with James Bond, and most recently with Paddington Bear.
Yes, the taking the marmalade sandwich out of the handbag was perfectly timed.
It was, and I was working at the time of that with Dame Judi Dench. Dame Judi Dench said to me, "Oh goodness, she's so good. She's going to be doing people like me out of work."
Charles, just to finish, talk a bit about the Queen and the late Duke and their relationship, what you observed of it, how they complemented each other.
It was for her a lifetime's relationship. They were both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. It's often said that they met in 1939 at Dartmouth, at a naval event. That's not true. They met before then. They were cousins. They knew one another. But from that time, 1939 onwards, she really had eyes for nobody else. And because there was that invisible moat around the Queen, no one could be quite normal with her. The only people who really could be normal with her were her parents, her sister, and her husband. Nobody else, could say to the Queen, could call the Queen darling, except Prince Philip. And nobody could say to Prince Philip, "Oh, Philip, do shut up," except the Queen. And she did.
Charles, thank you very much. Thanks for being with us, Charles Brandreth.
Now, at 11 on this BBC News special, we're going to Northern Ireland. We've talked a lot about Ireland, North and South in the last few hours because the Queen's influence in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was considerable, particularly in the last period of her reign. We're joined by Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. And it's true, Sir Geoffrey, isn't it, that the tributes from all parties in Northern Ireland, and indeed from the Taoiseach and other political leaders in the Republic, are genuinely heartfelt?
I think that's absolutely right, and when the history of this period is recorded, I think there will be a recognition of the significance of the contribution of Her Majesty the Queen, not only in the era of the peace process in the latter years of her reign, but also during the dark days of our troubled past in Northern Ireland. When Her Majesty visited Northern Ireland, I remember on the occasion of her Silver Jubilee, being invited as a school child to a special event where there were children from all kinds of backgrounds and all types of schools in Northern Ireland gathered to celebrate that particular occasion. But I think it was, and so during the Troubles, she came, she visited, she spent time with people, and I think that offered hope to many in Northern Ireland in those very dark days. But also, of course, Her Majesty and her family were impacted by the Troubles in Northern Ireland with the tragic killing, the murder of Lord Mountbatten by the IRA, and that, I think, brought home to the Queen the depth of suffering in Northern Ireland and the impact that it has on families. And so when she would meet with victims on her many visits to Hillsborough, Royal Hillsborough as it now is in my constituency, she had a real empathy with people. She understood what they had been through, and I think one of the most remarkable moments in our journey to peace and relative stability was the Queen's visit to the Republic of Ireland.
Yes.
I think that was a truly cathartic moment in British-Irish relations, and I have no doubt that that visit and the Queen's remarks during the visit laid to rest some of the ghosts of Anglo-Irish history.
Well, indeed, that visit in 2011, Simon Sharma, the historian, was talking about it a moment ago and saying the speech in Dublin Castle was one that really touched the heart of the difficulty that there had been between Dublin and London, just to put it in simple terms, for generations, really. And you can look back at it and say, well, was it necessary to do these kinds of symbolic acts? And in fact, the weight of that visit in setting to right some of the historic grievances and grumbles that had been lurking there in British-Irish relations for generations was considerable, and no individual politician would have been able to do that. Isn't that the point?
It is the point, and I think that's absolutely right. It wasn't just what the Queen said. It was the person who was saying it. It was, this wonderful woman who has been our sovereign, our head of state for so long, and symbolised for many on the island of Ireland. On the Unionist side, she is someone that we are intensely loyal to. She symbolises for us the embodiment of what it means to be British. But for others on the island of Ireland, of course, it is different. But here she was, the head of state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, speaking words of healing. And I think that impacted across the divide in Northern Ireland and on the island itself. And I think no one else could have delivered that. It wasn't just what she said, it was who she was and the manner in which she delivered it that made such a huge impact.
So Geoffrey Donaldson, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, the Queen always had to choose her words well and often extremely carefully. In 1940, at the height of the Blitz, the then Princess Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret were moved from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle to escape the bombing. She was only 14, and that year was the one when she made her first public speech, and it was on BBC Radio's Children's Hour.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all.
In 1982, the year in which British troops went to defend the Falkland Islands, she spoke of its necessity.
We owe our independence to the seamen who fought the Armada nearly 400 years ago, and to Nelson and his band of brothers who destroyed Napoleon's dreams of invasion. Nor could the great battles for peace and freedom in the first half of the 20th century have been won without control of the seas. Earlier this year, in the South Atlantic, the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy enabled our sailors, soldiers and airmen to go to the rescue of the Falkland Islanders, 8,000 miles across the ocean, and to reveal the professional skills and courage that could be called on in defence of basic freedom.
Dr. Linda Yu, Chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society, thank you.
It's just after 11:30. Let's get a summary of events from Chris Aldrich.
Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said she passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire. The crown transferred immediately to her son Charles, who will be known as King Charles III. He said his mother's death was a moment of great sadness for him and his family. Every living Prime Minister has paid tribute. Liz Truss said the Queen was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Sir Tony Blair said her reign had been glorious and the country had lost its matriarch. Commonwealth leaders have expressed their sadness. India's Narendra Modi said she was a stalwart of our times, while New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern said the Queen had worked until the very end on behalf of the people she loved. The world's other royal families have also reflected on her 70-year reign, with King Felipe of Spain saying she would be remembered as one of the greatest queens of all time. And from London to Wellington and to Washington, D.C., flags are being flown at half-mast.
Chris Aldrich, thank you very much. And indeed, of course, a flag at half-mast on Buckingham Palace. Our Home Affairs editor, Mark Easton, is there. And Mark, crowds were gathering early. It's been a pretty stormy old day, pretty wet in London. What's the scene there now?
There are still hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of people here. I'm standing in front of one of the gates of the palace. People keep coming up and laying flowers at what's already a very significant sized tribute to Her Majesty, and attached to the railings themselves, many people have put bunches of flowers in among the railings, but also a black and white Union flag, and taped to that is a quotation the Queen herself said after 9/11, "Grief is the price we pay for love." And one can really feel that love, that affection, that respect in the mood here right now. There are candles being lit, people treating this moment with enormous reverence, actually, a very somber mood. And I do think that this is a very significant moment for Britain, because the Queen really was the kind of keystone in the nation's architecture, a sort of solid and immovable piece that held the country's image of itself in place.
It's interesting, Mark, that you're there outside the palace, because, of course, we can all remember scenes from the various jubilees, from celebrations of all kinds, weddings, indeed funerals too, where the crowds have surged down the Mall towards the palace, and where the Queen has led her family onto that balcony. We'll never see that again. The days of Spitfire flypasts are beginning to fade into the distance. There is a whole era which encapsulates the Second World War, all its aftermath, the immediate years, and the couple of generations that remembered it. And the Queen represented that, and in a sense that is slipping away, not to be forgotten, but to go out of the immediate minds of those who were born long afterwards.
I think that's exactly right. She was a representative of the greatest generation, and the values that she espoused throughout her long reign were those which I think were matched by many from that generation. But you know, what's interesting about the crowds here at Buckingham Palace is that they represent the great diversity of her kingdom in age, in ethnicity, in class and background. In fact, I'm struck by just how young the crowds are here. They certainly will not remember the Queen other than in the last perhaps 20 years or so.
That's a really interesting observation, that there are young people there in great numbers.
Very significant numbers, yes, and I think that they are here. I mean, there will be some, of course, who are here for the sort of Instagram moment, but one gets a powerful sense that actually they're here because they feel this is a moment in their lives, a moment of great import, and they want to be part of that, and they want to also, I think, to be together, actually. I think this is quite a discombobulating moment for the country. She was this great source of stability. She did, in her own words, ease the process of change. And we're now going to experience a very significant change and she won't be there to ease it. And I think it's quite a moment, this.
Mark Easton, our home editor at Buckingham Palace.
Looking at more of the front pages of tomorrow, where the papers have taken their pick of photographs over the long reign, and the Financial Times has got a photograph of the Queen, pictured a few decades ago, probably in her full evening dress and regalia, and the Sun is all a black background and a purple masthead with the words "We loved you, Ma'am." And alongside the picture, "We are proud you were our Queen." Helen Catt, our political correspondent, joins us from our Westminster studio. We've had political leaders' tributes already, Helen. What about proceedings in the Houses of Parliament? There will be a chance for MPs tomorrow to start paying their own tributes to the Queen in the Commons. So the Commons will sit a little later than it was going to. It'll start at noon tomorrow and run through till 10 o'clock at night. There will also be a special sitting on Saturday, which will run from 2 in the afternoon until 10 o'clock at night, again to allow MPs to pay their tributes. And as you said, we've already had quite a lot of tributes come in from across the political spectrum. You heard earlier of Liz Truss standing in Downing Street. She opened the tributes, as she will do in the Commons tomorrow, talking about the Queen as having been the rock on which modern Britain was built, that she was loved and admired by people of the UK and across the world. We've also had tributes paid by the opposition leaders, as you would expect. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said that the Queen had been above the clashes of politics. She stood not for what the nation fought over, but for what it agreed upon. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, saying she'd been a reminder of our greatest generation and the sacrifices made for our freedom today. It seems very fitting and important that one of her last acts in the last few days of her life was to meet and greet a new Prime Minister. It was. The Queen fulfilled this role in Westminster. She had a special place in that she was above party politics, but she had this distinct role in the functioning of government, the functioning of democracy in the UK. And she was doing that right until the end, as you said, appointing a new Prime Minister just 2 days ago. Liz Truss, of course, the 15th Prime Minister that the Queen saw in Downing Street. Her first was Sir Winston Churchill. All 6 of those Prime Ministers who are still living, the former Prime Ministers who are still living, have paid their tribute, shared their memories, their condolences. And the themes that come through that sort of unite their tributes are that sense of duty, this devotion to duty that comes up several times. They talk about having, David Cameron, for example, said that she was the world's greatest public servant, and he talked about having really valued her sage advice and wise counsel in those weekly audiences that Prime Ministers had with the Queen. And again, that is something that was echoed by others, by Gordon Brown, who said she was considerate, she was caring, she was endlessly patient, he said, even when talking about the details of a boring budget. But most of all, he said, what shone through was her complete and utter dedication to the country. Yes, it's been fascinating to hear the personal twist that there have been, and in all of these statements, whether they're from leaders here, leaders overseas as well. And now, after the period of mourning, in due course, it will be King Charles who has those audiences with the new Prime Minister. It will. The monarch does play this role with government. They have that weekly audience with the Prime Minister, which certainly with the Queen we know they really valued, because in somewhere in a postcode, in somewhere where there is this sort of rough and tumble of political life, the monarch is a constant that is above all of that. And certainly, particularly the Queen, because of the length of her reign, she was a real constant figure, in a sense, when governments come and governments go. Helen Catt, political correspondent, thank you.
It's true that Prime Ministers have been talking through the day about those audiences. They can't give details of what passed between them and the Queen, but they've all indicated how valuable and how stimulating and indeed how testing these audiences were. And now, as Helen Catt and Michelle were saying, they will take place with King Charles III, who will begin, presumably after the period of mourning is over, to give weekly audiences to the Prime Minister Liz Truss, appointed by his mother on Tuesday. It is the start of a new reign, a new king. What kind of monarch will he be? Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond looks at the life of the former Prince of Wales.
This is the BBC Home Service. It has just been announced from Buckingham Palace that Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered of a prince at 9:14 p.m.
At his birth, the then Poet Laureate offered him the loyal love and service of a race. He was born into a very different nation, deferential and hierarchical, defined by victory in war and its ruinous economic price, destined to see its empire fall swiftly away.
Sir, I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted queen.
When Charles was 4 years old, his mother would become queen. Her duties and her sense of service would cut into the time she spent with him. Aged 8, he went to boarding school, first in the south of England and then on to Scotland, to Gordonston, his father's school, which he hated. Solemn and serious, with low self-esteem, only at university did he start to become comfortable in his skin. In 1969 came the first ceremonial solemnity with Charles at its centre, his investiture as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle. There would be time in the armed forces and a search for a role and a wife. Lady Diana Spencer was young and very beautiful and seemingly bowled over at the prospect of being a princess. Some wondered at what the introspective, bookish prince had in common with the teenager with little in the way of intellectual interests. But in the midst of economic depression and national division, much of the nation rejoiced at the regal fantasia of their wedding. They did not grow together. Instead, the marriage fell apart. But in the early years, children came and the cracks were covered up. And still the prince searched for a role. Back in the 70s, he'd founded the Prince's Trust to help develop the skills of disadvantaged young people.
I'm one of those people that feels that everybody's got some talent or potential or skill or whatever, which so often is not brought out and not developed at a young age by anybody in particular. And sometimes through lack of confidence and so on, these things don't materialize.
There were other, more controversial interests embraced and speeches made. Some now seem far-sighted. When he took up the cause of organic farming methods, they were viewed as quackery. Now they are mainstream. And very early on, he had supported environmental causes.
There is chemical pollution discharged into rivers from factories and chemical plants, which clogs up the rivers with toxic substances and adds to the filth in the seas. There is air pollution from smoke and fumes discharged by factories and from gases pumped out by endless cars and aeroplanes.
But his support for homeopathic medicine and healing, his outspokenness on some social issues, and his assaults on modern architecture led to complaints that he was abusing his unelected position. He pushed back.
I'm sometimes accused of wanting to return to the past, to encourage everyone to live in a kind of glorified Disneyland. That's not the case at all. But I do believe that if we are going to come up with an architecture we might actually like again, we have to strip away some of the nonsensical dogma of the day and think about fundamental principles once again.
And there was more to upset those who look to the monarchy for continuity in times of change. For 450 years, the sovereign has been supreme governor of the Church of England. The title, Defender of the Faith, has come to mean Defender of the Anglican Church. But the Prince said he wanted something different.
I personally, you see, would much rather see it as Defender of Faith, not the faith. Because it means just one particular interpretation of the faith, which I think is sometimes something that causes a great deal of problem. It has done for hundreds of years. People have fought each other to the death over these things. It seems to me a peculiar waste of people's energy.
Whilst his embrace of some causes won him plaudits, his outspokenness also caused alarm. In the 70s, he'd been nicknamed Action Man,
But as the 80s wore on, there was more derision. And as his failing marriage became public knowledge, he began to lose the public relations battle waged with Princess Diana. By the early 90s, his marriage was dead in all but name. She put her side of the story into print through a friendly journalist. The marriage was over. The announcement came from the Prime Minister, John Major.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
More and worse was to come. Public support for the prince fell and fell as the princess and her friends briefed relentlessly against him. In a documentary interview with Jonathan Dimbleby, the heir to the throne admitted his infidelity.
Did you try to be faithful and honourable to your wife when you took on the vow of marriage?
Yes, absolutely.
And you were?
Yes. Until it became irretrievably broken down. I suppose having tried.
The couple divorced. In 1997, in Paris, tragedy. Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed when her car smashed into the pillar of an underpass. Charles's public position fell again. In the years that followed, he introduced his longtime love, Camilla Parker Bowles, to the British public. He was determined to bring her out of the shadows. And in 2005, they married, a civil ceremony followed by a blessing by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Prince still supported a dizzying array of causes, and it emerged that he was a regular correspondent with government ministers, urging them to act one way or another. His activism caused alarm in some circles. In 2018, in an interview to mark his 70th birthday, he drew a line between how he acted as Prince of Wales and how he would behave as sovereign. Would the activism, he was asked, continue as king?
No, it won't. I'm not that stupid. I do realise that it is a separate exercise, being sovereign. So of course, I understand entirely how that should operate. You could only do it with the agreement of ministers. That's how it works.
It has been a long and turbulent apprenticeship, often in the eye of controversy. A once troubled personal life, now in calmer waters, with decades spent considering the role he now inherits.
That report from Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent. Well, let's talk a little more about the Queen's charities, which were very important to her, and she held many patronages until the last few years, really. We're joined by Sir Michael Aronson, former Chief Executive of Save the Children, and by Michelle Lee Uzu, Executive Director of Development and Innovation at Barnardo's, two of those charities, of which the Queen was a patron. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
So Michael, tell us about your experience of and your interactions with the Queen in her role.
Well, the Queen was our patron, and her daughter Princess Anne was our president. And obviously Princess Anne was very involved with the charity, was very hard-working president. But the Queen was always there behind her, and every so often, I think probably because Princess Anne asked her, Her Majesty would grace us with attendance at an event, a reception, a fundraising event, whatever it was. And I think for the charity, having that seal of approval from somebody who was so important to the entire nation was really very beneficial to our cause and the work we were trying to do.
And on those occasions, how informed was she about your work?
Oh, she was always very well informed about everything. As I say, she wasn't as closely involved as Princess Anne was, but I've no doubt that she was immensely well informed and indeed proud of the work that her daughter did for us as our president. The monarchy is an institution, the royal family is a family, and and the Queen's daughter was our president, and I have no doubt that the Queen took a very active interest and was very proud of the role she played.
Michelle Lizu, what about your experience at Barnardo's?
Yes, we were very privileged that the Queen was our patron for 30 years, and in 2016 she handed over the role to the Queen Consort, who had previously been president. So she really supported our work with vulnerable children and young people, really helped to raise awareness. And also I think raise the morale of our staff and volunteers when she met with them, because they really loved her. And on the occasion I was there when that happened, just seeing the difference it made to staff and volunteers was enormous.
That's interesting. So it's not just about donors or fundraising, it's about how it motivates the people who are doing the day-to-day work of the charity.
Yes, it's all those things, the cause, the fundraising and the morale of those who work for us.
Yes. So in a way, in a parallel to what Michael Aronson was saying about Save the Children, so she handed over the patronage at Barnardo's to her daughter-in-law.
Yes, she did. Yes, along with at the time several other charities, she made the same decision, and I think that was about sharing that patronage within the royal family.
Which again is important, because then there's a follow-on from the influence and the impact that she's had. She's kind of making sure that there's someone else within her family who she can rely on and trust to do that role.
Absolutely, and we're incredibly grateful to our current patron, who is the Queen Consort, for continued support as we protect Barnardo's children and nurture those vulnerable children and young people right across the UK.
And Michael Aronson, how did you find her personally?
Well, it was always a bit of a surprise, given her immense presence as our monarch and the huge weight of responsibilities that she bore. When one actually met her, one was struck by the fact that she was physically quite a tiny person, and very calm and very quiet, but immense. What Michelle was talking about there, immense professionalism in making everybody feel welcome, everybody feel at ease, having time for people, really genuinely wanting to listen to what people have to say, not just passing down a line and shaking the odd hand. That's a great quality, and I think it certainly did mean an awful lot to people who met her, and certainly did provide an important stimulus to their motivation working for the charity.
So Michael Aronson and Michelle Lizu, thank you very much.
It's about 5 to 12 now. We're moving to the end of this news special, bringing all radio networks together. Let's hear some voices from abroad, because many have been making themselves heard in the course of the day. Here are two contributions to the tributes to the Queen. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
In a complicated world, her steady grace and resolve brought comfort and strength to us all. Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so.
Justin Trudeau, and from another Commonwealth country, New Zealand, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern.
The last days of the Queen's life captures who she was in so many ways, working till the very end on behalf of the people she loved. And that is why I'm sure that we will receive the news of her passing with both emotions of deep sadness, but also gratitude for a life that was utterly and completely devoted to the service of others.
The New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. And James Landale, our diplomat correspondent, is with us. James, it is remarkable. You take these two clips that we've just heard from Commonwealth Prime Ministers. They're not just routine observations. They mean it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, Mr. Trudeau could not keep the emotion out of his voice. He was breaking. He was close to tears. He's known the Queen since he was a boy.
Right, his father had known them
as Prime Minister. So, this is a woman that's, he's known personally for that length of time. And the one thing that, whenever I talk to world leaders, they constantly, particularly those in the Commonwealth, they all just raved about the Queen because of the impact and judgment that they could rely on.
One of the things that's always struck me about this is that the Queen, in the Commonwealth context, at the Commonwealth conferences, for example, which you've attended over the years, can operate as a sort of as a force in the room. She can bring people together, she can try to bang heads together, she can promote ideas in a way that she can't in the domestic political context at home. It gave her the chance to use some of those skills that all our Prime Ministers talk about in a way that she's prohibited from doing, quite rightly, in this country.
Yeah, and played a key role in keeping a lot of African countries together during the campaign against apartheid. Very much also in terms of the formation of Zimbabwe and the last days of Rhodesia, at a time when there was talk of Commonwealth conferences not being held or her not being allowed to go because there was fear of assassination. She said, no, I've got to go. So in that context, she played a real diplomatic role in a way that was not interventionist, but she asked the right questions and she brought the convening power and just allowed a space to operate and exist for politicians to actually reach their solutions.
And I think, if you look at tributes, Joe Biden, for example, has said, in a world of constant change, she was a steadying presence and a source of comfort and pride for generations of Britons, including many who've never known their country without her. Her legacy will loom large in the pages of British history and in the story of our world. You're getting serious, practical politicians, Biden, Macron, to take two obvious examples. We're saying this is somebody who was actually at home on the world stage. If you're sitting at dinner and having to spend an evening with Donald Trump or whatever it happens to be, there's some difficult moments. But, that's a little it's 12 o'clock, we can say anything we like now, can't we? But, she was able to navigate some pretty choppy waters.
And that's in part because she knew more than anybody else. She had been reading diplomatic and intelligence documents since 1952. There was no other human being on earth who did that, and that meant that she could talk on equal terms with those leaders that she was engaged with.
And of course, for younger leaders, they thought to themselves, British Prime Minister thought, gosh, she used to talk to Churchill. And American leaders would say, she talked to Eisenhower and Kennedy. It's quite a thing to think about.
Yeah, and it meant that they took what she said seriously in a way that didn't happen with anybody else.
We won't see her like again.
No, absolutely not. Certainly not on the international stage.
James Landale, thank you very much.
Just a final word as we approach midnight and the end of this special programme about tomorrow morning's newspapers, the images of the Queen, of course, but the words that they have chosen, they are largely words of thanks or a life in service, about love for the Queen, broken hearts and her doing her duty. It says it all, really. This is the end of this special programme for BBC News at the end of this day when Queen Elizabeth II died at the age of 96. Thank you for listening from Jim, me and our colleagues across the newsroom. Good night.
BBC News at midnight. This is Chris Aldridge. The death has been announced of Queen Elizabeth II, the nation's longest-serving monarch who was head of state for 70 years. She was 96. Fears for her health had been mounting throughout the day after royal officials revealed she was under medical supervision at Balmoral. The UK's new king, Charles III, said the death of his beloved mother was the greatest sadness for his family and would be felt across the world. The outpouring of messages of condolence has been global, with leaders from all continents remembering her as a stateswoman of unmatched dignity. In Britain, Buckingham Palace became a focus of national mourning, with thousands gathering outside, singing "God Save the Queen." In tonight's bulletin, we'll reflect on a life of service which stretches back further than most can remember, and consider what next for the United Kingdom. At 6:30 this evening, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II. She died peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire this afternoon, after doctors had raised concerns about her health in the morning. The news has sparked an outpouring of grief as the United Kingdom mourns the death of its longest reigning monarch, and the world reflects on the loss of a figurehead of stability for the past 70 years. Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond has tonight's first report on a day which marked the end of an era.
A short statement from Buckingham Palace just after midday was the first indication that the Queen's condition was serious. The statement said that the Queen's doctors were concerned for her health and had recommended that she remain under medical supervision. Robert Hardman, biographer of the Queen, said that was a source of grave concern.
This morning's statement from the palace was an alarming one because the Queen has always been very reluctant to discuss her health, so to have a bulletin saying that her doctors are concerned she's under supervision, that was very unexpected.
Late last year, the Queen began to withdraw from a series of high-profile events. In June this year, she was absent from the service of Thanksgiving at her Platinum Jubilee. But 3 times she appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and 3 times the crowd made their feelings clear. Appearances since then were few. A long break in Balmoral is traditional over the summer, but there would be no return from her beloved Scottish retreat. Just after 1 o'clock today, with concern over the Queen's condition mounting, the Speaker addressed the House of Commons.
I know I speak on behalf of the entire House when I say that we send our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen, and that she and the royal family are in our thoughts and prayers at this moment.
As the afternoon drew on, another mark of the seriousness of the situation. One by one, members of the royal family changed their plans and made their way towards Balmoral. Prince Charles and Princess Anne were already in Scotland. From RAF Northolt came a plane carrying Prince Andrew, Prince Edward and Prince William. Around an hour after landing in Aberdeen, cars at the gates of the castle. All day, rumours had swirled around the country and the world about the Queen's condition. But just after 6:30, a 26-word statement came from Buckingham Palace.
This is BBC News. We're interrupting our schedules for the following announcement. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
The King and the Queen Consort, the statement went on, would remain at Balmoral and would return to London on Friday. The new King released a statement. He wrote of his great sadness at the death of his beloved mother, of how the royal family mourned profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign. Outside Buckingham Palace, a time-honoured tradition. The death notice of the monarch brought out on an easel for public display. Outside 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister, just 2 days in office, addressed the nation. It was she who revealed how the King will be known in Britain and around the world.
It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty King Charles III.
And a torrent of tributes began, from presidents, prime ministers and monarchs, from faith leaders, from the charities the Queen championed, and from those who gathered in the rain outside Balmoral and Buckingham Palace. Across the country, across the world, flags were lowered in mourning and in respect. A lifetime of service had drawn to a close.
The Queen's home at Balmoral has been the focus of attention throughout the afternoon after it emerged that her health had deteriorated. Our correspondent Lorna Gordon sent this report from outside the estate.
Balmoral has been described as the place where the Queen felt most at home.
Surrounded by hills and heather, its seclusion affording privacy to a monarch whose life was lived in the public eye. And it was here, under low clouds and in driving rain, that senior royals gathered. All four of her children, the new king, King Charles III, his wife Camilla, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, who was already in Scotland undertaking royal duties. Then late afternoon, a motorcade swept in, containing members of the royal household who'd flown to the airport in Aberdeen, which is little over an hour's drive from the Deeside estate. Among the passengers, the Duke of York, the Count and Countess of Wessex. One car was driven by Prince William, Prince Harry arriving later. One of those who'd gathered to pay their respects outside the castle gates remarked that they hoped it was some comfort to the Queen's family that she got to spend her last days in the place she loved so much.
Horrified. Expected, though, wasn't it? You know, before all the family and everybody is here.
That's kind of heavy news to take in at the minute.
Shocking, obviously. I mean, I think it sadly was expected, but yeah, it's quite shocking.
Oh, it's sad, and it's just been part of everyone's lives. Well, it's all my life, as long as I've been alive.
There are now a growing number of flowers and messages. The card on one said it was dedicated to a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, our Queen. The note of condolence ended with the words, "Your job here is done, rest easy."
People have been leaving flowers at the gates of Windsor Castle, and a crowd of tens of thousands has gathered in front of Buckingham Palace. Our correspondent Lucy Manning is there.
They streamed through the streets of London, up the Mall to Buckingham Palace. The news passed quietly through the crowds as people stood and watched as the Union flag was lowered to half-mast. At first there were just a few hundred people, but as the rain and night fell, thousands came. I thought she was fantastic, a role model for everybody, and never put a foot wrong, did she?
I mean, I think people have complicated thoughts about the royal family and empires and things like that. I think that's okay, but she's been leader of this country for so many decades, really longer than a lot of people have been alive, so it's a very sad day.
Yeah, I can't really believe it, to be honest. I know she's getting older, but it's one of them things you never believe going to happen. That's quite upsetting, really.
No one here, truthfully, was sure what to do, but they know they wanted to be here, to stand, to mark the moment, to bring flowers, to remember. There was applause, there was the anthem, words that have echoed here for 70 years. Around 50 black cabs line the Mall under dark and rainy skies to pay tribute to the Queen.
Went out on social media shortly after she passed away. It would be a nice touch for all the cabbies to come to the Mall and line up, form a procession. So that's what we did. I think she was great. I mean, the amount of tourism that she brought in, you know, from our point of view as cabbies, she kept us busy. And she was just a great person, I think.
Her kingdom is united in sorrow, but also in admiration, in the sense that people here feel fortunate to have lived in her era. She was long to reign over us. Through change and turmoil, there has always been the Queen.
Liz Truss, who only 2 days ago met the Queen to be formally installed as Britain's 56th Prime Minister, emerged from Downing Street to lead the tributes.
In the difficult days ahead, we will come together with our friends across the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and the world to celebrate her extraordinary lifetime of service. It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
Throughout her reign, the Queen met and worked with 15 of the UK's Prime Ministers, the first being Winston Churchill in 1952. There's been unanimous praise from across the political spectrum for her. Our political correspondent Helen Catt reports.
In Westminster, the Queen held a special place. She was above party politics, but with a distinct role in the functioning of government. The leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, said the nation will always treasure her life of service and devotion.
Above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon. In crisis, she reassured us, reminding us that we are all part of something that stretches back through time, a symbol of the destiny.
The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davies, said the Queen had been a reminder of our greatest generation and the sacrifices made for our freedom today.
Today we are a family of nations in mourning, as we remember the steadfastness, the resolve and the love that Queen Elizabeth II brought our world and our country.
The Queen saw 15 Prime Ministers in Downing Street, the first Sir Winston Churchill. All 6 living former Prime Ministers have sent their condolences and shared memories of the Queen. Boris Johnson said it was our country's saddest day and wrote of her deep wisdom and historic understanding. David Cameron called the Queen the world's greatest public servant and said he had valued her sage advice and wise counsel in their weekly audiences. Theresa May said she was immensely knowledgeable.
Queen Elizabeth II was respected around the world, and her devotion to duty, she gave a lifetime of service. This was an inspiration to us all. But of course, we mustn't forget, while we're thinking of our own memories of her, that she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family.
Another Conservative former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, agreed that the Queen was always enormously well briefed, but said that one-on-one she was also very human and empathetic.
I suppose if she had had to choose, she would have been happy being a country woman with her dogs and her horses, with a love of our remarkable armed forces. But she was Queen, and she understood the duties that required and the example that needed to be set. And it would be difficult for anyone to say that she didn't perform that role in an exemplary manner.
The former Labour Prime Minister, Sir Tony Blair, described the Queen as the matriarch of our nation. His successor, Gordon Brown, said she would be mourned across the Commonwealth.
She was considerate, she was caring, she had a great sense of humour, she was endlessly patient, even when talking about the details of a boring budget. But most of all, what shone through was her complete and utter dedication to the country.
From noon, MPs will begin paying their tributes to the Queen in the Commons. There will also be a special sitting on Saturday to allow them to continue saying goodbye to a monarch whom the Speaker described as having given a sense of equilibrium to people's lives.
The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has praised the Queen's dedication and devotion and hailed the decades of life she had given in service. She said her death was a profoundly sad moment for the UK and for the people of Scotland especially.
Scotland loved, respected and admired her, and by all accounts Her Majesty was really happier than when she was here in Scotland at her beloved Balmoral, a fact I have been privileged to observe personally. I hope it will be a source of comfort to her family that she spent her final days in a place that she loved so much.
The flags of Holyrood House in Edinburgh and those at the Scottish Parliament and government buildings were lowered to half-mast after her death was announced, reflecting the particular affection the people of Scotland had for the Queen. She had a special place in her heart for the nation too, as our Scotland editor James Cook reports from outside Balmoral Castle.
The Queen's affection for Scotland was, in her own words, deep and abiding. Descended from Stuart kings and Scottish aristocracy, Elizabeth's roots in this nation ran deep. Within weeks of the coronation in 1953, the young Queen and her husband were touring Scotland. The welcome was warm, although her title, Elizabeth II, left some cold. She was in fact the first Elizabeth to rule Scotland. Eyebrows were also raised at her Silver Jubilee in 1977, when the Queen responded to Labour's plans to devolve power to Edinburgh and Cardiff by stressing the benefits which union had conferred. And yet, 2 decades later, it was the Queen who opened the new Scottish Parliament, praising the national character of the Scots as she did so. From the Highland Games at Braemar to the coal mines of Fife, as the first monarch to visit Shetland since the Vikings, and the last to send great ships roaring into the Clyde, Elizabeth was a queen who embodied the union of the Scottish and English crowns.
The First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, said Queen Elizabeth upheld the values and traditions of the British monarchy. The Archbishop of Wales described her as a loyal servant to the people. More from our correspondent Hal Griffith.
Outside the Senedd, the flags of the Welsh Parliament are at half-mast and flowers have been laid as people pay their tributes to the Queen. Her relationship with Wales stretched back to her first visit as a young princess, but it was defined by the events of 1966 and the Aberfan mine disaster, in which 116 children and 28 adults lost their lives. At first hesitant to travel to the village, she then visited repeatedly over the course of several decades to meet the survivors and support the community. In recent years, the focus of royal visits switched to the Senedd as it grew in power and responsibility. Her presence at state openings for some lent legitimacy to an institution still in its infancy. It was to the Senedd that she made her final visit to Wales in October last year. The First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has led tributes by saying she will be sorely missed by all the organisations in Wales she championed and supported over many decades.
Political leaders from across the divide in Northern Ireland have praised the Queen for her efforts to advance peace and reconciliation. For much of her reign, Northern Ireland was engulfed by the Troubles. The fighting affected her personally, as our Ireland correspondent Chris Page explains.
The tributes in Northern Ireland show the Queen had earned respect across traditional divides, in a way that few other public figures have ever done. The leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, said she was a steadfast and unshakable head of state. At the other end of the political spectrum, the Sinn Féin Vice President Michelle O'Neill said she personally valued the Queen's work for reconciliation throughout these islands. For about 30 of Her Majesty's 70 years on the throne, Northern Ireland was possibly the most troubled part of her realm. The conflict touched the Queen very personally when her cousin, Lord Mountbatten, was murdered by the IRA in 1979. Later, she made some defining contributions to the peace process, most notably when she became the first British monarch to visit the Republic of Ireland in 2011. The following year, in another highly powerful gesture, she shook hands with the former IRA commander, the late Martin McGuinness, who as a Sinn Féin politician had become the joint head of the power-sharing devolved government. During the Queen's 25 visits to Northern Ireland, she often stayed in her official residence, Hillsborough Castle in County Down. In the village of Royal Hillsborough, people have been considering what she meant to them.
She really was the United Kingdom, and she represented everything, what she's been through, what she's done over the last 70 plus years for the country.
Very inspirational. She held true to what she promised when she was going to be Queen, that she would serve her country till the day she died, and clearly she did.
The loss of Queen Elizabeth II is being felt particularly strongly in the Unionist community. But those who identify as Irish rather than British, or even as neither, are also reflecting on how she helped Northern Ireland recover from dark times.
World leaders have been reflecting on their encounters with the Queen. During her 70-year reign, she met 13 of the last 14 US presidents, 12 Canadian prime ministers, and visited all 54 Commonwealth countries except for Cameroon. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
Throughout her reign, the Queen played a constant and significant role on the international stage. She was the monarch of 15 realms, the head of a commonwealth of some 56 nations, and her death prompted an outpouring of sorrow and regret in every corner of the globe. Across the Atlantic, flags flew at half-mast at the White House, and President Biden issued a statement saying the Queen had been a stateswoman of unmatched dignity and constancy. At the United Nations in New York, there was a minute's silence. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, could not contain his emotion at the passing of a woman he first met as a boy.
As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so.
Across the Channel, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, said the Queen had embodied the continuity and unity of the British nation as a friend of France and someone who made her mark on her century and her country. Pope Francis said he was offering his prayers for the Queen's eternal rest and praised her steadfast faith. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, said she'd been a beacon of calm and stability. And in a statement, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said,
"With deep sadness I have learned of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a heavy loss for the whole of Europe and the world. From all Ukrainians, I express sincere condolences to the royal family, the whole of the UK and the Commonwealth countries. Our thoughts and prayers are with you."
Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, who met the Queen in more peaceful times, offered his condolences, saying she had enjoyed the love and respect of her subjects and had authority on the world stage. Across the Commonwealth, there was gratitude and respect for a life of duty and service to an international body comprising more than 2.5 billion people. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, said the Queen personified dignity and decency in public life. And Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, said it was a time of enormous loss.
The last days of the Queen's life captures who she was in so many ways, working till the very end on behalf of the people she loved.
In South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the Queen's commitment and dedication was a noble and virtuous example to the entire world. The President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, described the Queen as the rock that kept the Commonwealth sturdy and true, remembering her elegance, style, and the sheer joy she brought to the performance of her duty.